Çatalhöyük Civilization. For much of modern history, archaeologists believe that civilization followed a rigid formula. First came agriculture, then permanent villages, then hierarchy, rulers, temples, and eventually writing. This sequence was treated as inevitable, almost biological. But buried beneath the plains of southern Anatolia, Çatalhöyük quietly dismantled that certainty. Discovered in the 1950s and extensively excavated beginning in the 1960s, Çatalhöyük dates to roughly 7,500 to 6,400 BC, thousands of years before writing and long before the rise of kings or organized states. At its height, it was home to several thousand people, making it one of the earliest known large-scale human settlements. Yet everything about it defies expectations. There were no streets. Instead, houses were packed tightly together, wall to wall, forming a continuous mass of mud brick structures. People moved across the settlement by walking on rooftops and entering their homes through openings in the ceiling. Ladders led down into interior living spaces, where daily life unfolded around hearths, ovens, and raised platforms used for sleeping, working, and ritual activity. This design was not accidental. It reflects a society that prioritized collective organization over individual display. What is most striking is what archaeologists did not find. There are no palaces, no administrative buildings, no obvious temples towering above the rest. The houses are remarkably uniform in size and construction, suggesting no clear ruling elite. Wealth, if it existed, was not expressed architecturally. Social power was not carved in stone. Religion, too, followed a different path. Instead of centralized temples, symbolic and ritual practices were embedded directly into domestic life. Wall paintings, geometric patterns, and animal imagery adorned the interiors of homes. Some rooms contain installations made from bull horns and plastered reliefs, while others include carefully placed human burials beneath floors and platforms. The dead were not separated from the living. They remained part of the household. This blurring of daily life and ritual challenges the assumption that complex belief systems require priesthoods or monumental sacred spaces. At Çatalhöyük, spiritual expression appears decentralized, personal, and integrated into the home itself. The economy of the settlement also reflects early complexity without hierarchy. Residents practiced agriculture, cultivating wheat, barley, and legumes, while also hunting wild animals. Obsidian tools, sourced from volcanic regions hundreds of kilometers away, indicate long-distance trade networks. This was not an isolated village. It was connected, informed, and adaptable. Yet for all its sophistication, Çatalhöyük left no written records, no inscriptions, no names of leaders, no myths etched into stone. Everything we know comes from architecture, material remains, and careful analysis of patterns left behind. And those patterns tell a quiet but disruptive story. Çatalhöyük demonstrates that large, dense, and stable human communities could exist without kings, without formal governments, and without written language. It shows that complexity does not have a single origin story. Civilization did not rise along one narrow path. It branched. Before history was written down, humanity was already experimenting with ways of living together. Çatalhöyük stands as evidence that some of those experiments succeeded for centuries, only to vanish without leaving a voice of their own. Göbekli Tepe builders. For most of the 20th century, the origin story of civilization seemed settled. Humans first learned to farm. Farming led to permanent villages. Villages created surplus, hierarchy, religion, and eventually monumental architecture. That sequence was taught as a rule. Göbekli Tepe breaks it. Located on a limestone ridge in southeastern Turkey, Göbekli Tepe dates to approximately 9600 to 8200 BCE, making it the oldest known monumental stone complex ever discovered. It predates Stonehenge by more than 6,000 years and the Egyptian pyramids by over 7,000. Most unsettling of all, it was built before clear evidence of agriculture, metal tools, pottery, or written language. At the heart of the site are massive T-shaped limestone pillars, some over 16 feet tall, and weighing many tons. These pillars are arranged in circular and oval enclosures, carefully planned and precisely constructed. Many are carved in high relief with animals, lions, foxes, snakes, boars, birds, and scorpions, rendered with a level of skill that implies experienced artisans. The imagery is consistent, symbolic, and deliberate. This was not random decoration. The central pillars of each enclosure often face one another, suggesting a focal point of ritual or meaning. Some pillars bear abstract symbols and stylized human forms, with arms, hands, and belts carved into the stone. While scholars debate their interpretation, there is broad agreement that these structures served a ceremonial or ritual function rather than a domestic one. No hearths, no storage rooms, no signs of everyday living. What makes Göbekli Tepe so disruptive is not just its age, but the implications of its construction. Building these enclosures required quarrying stone, transporting it, shaping it, and erecting it with coordination and planning. That level of organization implies shared beliefs, leadership structures, and long-term cooperation. These are traits traditionally associated with settled, agricultural societies. Yet the people who built Göbekli Tepe appear to have been hunter-gatherers. Archaeological evidence from the region indicates that large-scale farming developed later. In other words, monumental architecture came first. The act of gathering for ritual may have preceded, and even encouraged, the development of agriculture rather than the other way around. Equally puzzling is what happened next. After centuries of use, the enclosures at Göbekli Tepe were deliberately buried. Thousands of tons of soil and debris were carefully packed into the structures, preserving them but removing them from use. This was not abandonment caused by erosion or disaster. It was intentional. The builders themselves sealed the site. Why they did this remains unknown. No written records explain their beliefs. No descendants left stories behind. The society that organized Göbekli Tepe vanished before history could record its name. What remains is a silent contradiction carved into stone. Complex social behavior existed long before civilization was supposed to begin. Göbekli Tepe forces a re-evaluation of early human history. It suggests that shared ideas, symbolism, and ritual may have been the foundations of complex society, not its byproducts. Before cities, before farming, before writing, humans were already building monuments to meaning. And they did so well enough that 10,000 years later, the stone still stands. Harappan pre-urban phase. When the Indus Valley Civilization is mentioned, attention almost always jumps to its famous mature cities, Harappa, Mohenjo-daro, and Dhalavira, places of brick-lined streets, advanced drainage systems, and standardized weights. But long before those cities rose, an earlier and largely overlooked phase was already shaping the foundations of one of the world's great civilizations. This pre-urban stage, spanning roughly 700 to 3300 BCE, existed centuries before writing, monumental architecture, or large cities appeared in the region. The earliest evidence comes from sites such as Mehrgarh, located in present-day Pakistan near the Bolan Pass. Mehrgarh represents one of the oldest known farming settlements in South Asia. Its inhabitants practiced early agriculture, cultivating wheat and barley, and domesticated animals such as cattle, sheep, and goats. These were not nomadic camps. They were permanent communities, carefully organized and sustained over generations. What makes this phase significant is its continuity. Rather than appearing suddenly, the Indus civilization evolved gradually from these smaller settlements. Archaeologists have found early pottery styles, stone and copper tools, beads, and simple ornaments that show increasing technical skill over time. The ceramics become more standardized. Tool production becomes more specialized. Long-distance trade begins to emerge, evidenced by materials such as lapis lazuli and marine shells found far from their sources. Settlement layouts from this period suggest early planning. While not yet true cities, these communities show organized housing clusters, storage areas, and shared spaces. The structures are built with mud brick, often arranged in patterns that reflect social cooperation rather than random growth. This hints at emerging social systems capable of coordinating labor and managing resources without centralized authority or written administration. One of the most striking aspects of the pre-urban Harappan phase is its stability. These communities endured for thousands of years, adapting to environmental changes and expanding their networks. Unlike civilizations that appear to rise abruptly through conquest or collapse quickly under pressure, the Indus tradition shows patience. It builds slowly. Yet this entire phase is frequently overshadowed by what comes later. Once the mature Indus cities emerged around 2600 BCE, with their impressive urban planning and infrastructure, earlier settlements were retroactively treated as mere preludes. Their complexity was downplayed, their importance minimized. This oversight matters. Without the agricultural experimentation, craft traditions, and social organization developed during the pre-urban phase, the later cities could not have existed. Urban life did not appear fully formed. It was cultivated, refined, and tested across millennia. There is also a deeper implication. The pre-urban Harappan world shows that complex societies do not require writing, kings, or monumental temples to function. Like other prehistoric civilizations, these communities organized themselves through shared practices, local traditions, and long-term continuity rather than centralized power. Before the Indus script was ever carved onto seals, before grid-planned cities dominated the floodplains, a quieter civilization was already at work. It left fewer monuments, but its legacy shaped everything that followed. Nabta Playa complex. Long before the Nile became the backbone of Egyptian civilization, the Western Desert held a very different kind of society. Today, Nabta Playa lies in one of the most inhospitable regions of the Sahara Desert. But between roughly 7500 and 4500 BCE, this area was not a wasteland. It was a seasonal savanna, fed by monsoon rains, and it supported a network of prehistoric communities whose sophistication has only slowly come into focus. Nabta Playa is best known for its stone features. Scattered across the basin are circles, alignments, and megalithic slabs deliberately set into the ground. Some of these structures predate Stonehenge by several thousand years, making them among the earliest known monumental stone constructions in the world. Unlike later monuments associated with written cultures, these were created by people who left no texts, no inscriptions, and no named rulers. Archaeological evidence shows that the inhabitants of Nabta Playa were semi-nomadic pastoralists. They herded cattle, gathered wild plants, and returned to the area seasonally as water collected in the playa after the rains. Over time, these repeated gatherings appear to have taken on ritual importance. The placement of stones was not random. Several alignments correspond to solar events, such as the summer solstice, suggesting an early awareness of cyclical time and seasonal change. This is where Nabta Playa becomes especially significant. The astronomical alignments imply calendrical knowledge, an understanding of how celestial movements relate to environmental rhythms. For communities dependent on seasonal rains, this knowledge would have been essential for survival. It also suggests the presence of specialists who observed, remembered, and transmitted this information across generations. Burials and ceremonial features found nearby reinforce the idea that Nabta Playa was more than a temporary campsite. Some cattle were buried in carefully prepared pits, indicating symbolic or ritual value rather than simple economic use. These practices predate similar religious symbolism seen later in ancient Egypt, leading researchers to suggest cultural continuity rather than coincidence. Yet despite its importance, the Nabta Playa complex did not develop into a permanent urban center. Around 4500 BCE, climate patterns shifted. The African humid period ended, monsoon rains retreated southward, and the Sahara began its transformation into desert. Water sources vanished. The seasonal gatherings ceased. The people dispersed, likely migrating toward the Nile Valley where more stable conditions remained. This environmental collapse erased Nabta Playa from living memory. Wind and sand buried much of the evidence, and without written records, the civilization faded completely from history. Only modern archaeology brought it back into view. Nabta Playa challenges a familiar assumption that complex ceremonial life requires cities, agriculture, or centralized states. Here, long before pharaohs or pyramids, prehistoric communities organized ritual spaces, tracked the sky, and embedded cosmic order into the landscape itself. What survived is fragmentary, but the implication is clear. Before recorded history, humans were already measuring time, marking seasons, and shaping meaning out of stone. Nabta Playa stands as a reminder that some of the earliest foundations of civilization were laid not in cities, but in the open desert under changing skies. Samarra Culture. Before Mesopotamia became the land of cities, kings, and written law, it passed through quieter phases of experimentation that rarely receive attention. One of the most important of these is the Samarra culture, which flourished between roughly 5,500 and 4,800 BCE along the Middle Tigris River in what is now northern Iraq. It existed before true urbanization and long before writing, yet it played a critical role in shaping the social and technological foundations of later Mesopotamian civilization. The Samarra culture is often overshadowed by its better-known neighbors, the Halaf and Ubaid cultures. But archaeologically, it stands apart. Its material remains show a distinct identity, not a transitional blur. The most recognizable feature is its pottery. Samarra ceramics are finely made, thin-walled, and decorated with complex geometric patterns, animals, and stylized human figures. The precision and consistency of these designs suggests skilled specialists rather than casual household production. This level of craftsmanship points to organized knowledge transfer. Techniques were taught, preserved, and standardized across generations. That alone implies social structures capable of maintaining tradition without written instruction. In a prehistoric context, this is not trivial. Settlement patterns further distinguish the Samarra culture. Excavated sites show evidence of planned layouts rather than organic sprawl. Houses were often arranged in deliberate groupings, sometimes around shared spaces. Storage facilities and food processing areas indicate surplus management, a key step toward economic complexity. Irrigation channels found near some sites suggest early experimentation with water control, allowing communities to stabilize food production in an unpredictable environment. Unlike later Mesopotamian cities, Samarra settlements show no signs of monumental temples or palaces. There is no clear architectural hierarchy separating elites from common residents. This suggests that while social organization existed, it had not yet crystallized into rigid class structures. Authority, if present, was likely communal or situational rather than centralized. What makes the Samarra culture particularly important is its timing. It sits between small Neolithic farming villages and the later rise of large, stratified societies. During this period, people were learning how to live together at greater densities, manage resources, and coordinate labor beyond the household level. These experiments did not immediately produce cities, but they created the conditions under which cities would later emerge. The Samarra culture did not disappear abruptly. Instead, its practices gradually blended into those of the Ubaid period, which eventually spread across southern Mesopotamia. Elements such as pottery styles, settlement planning, and irrigation knowledge show continuity rather than collapse. The transition was evolutionary, not catastrophic. Because there are no written records, the Samarra culture has no voice of its own. It left no myths, no king lists, no laws etched into clay. What remains are patterns in soil and stone, revealing a society learning how to scale up human cooperation. Before Mesopotamia became the cradle of written history, cultures like Samarra were already laying its groundwork. They remind us that civilization was not born in a single moment, but assembled slowly, through forgotten stages that made everything else possible. Ubaid Civilization. Long before the Sumerians built the first true cities of southern Mesopotamia, the Ubaid civilization quietly shaped the foundations of urban life. Stretching from roughly 6,500 to 3,800 BCE, this prehistoric society occupied southern Iraq, along the fertile alluvial plains of the Tigris and Euphrates. Its settlements may seem modest compared to the monumental cities that followed, but the Ubaid period represents a critical stage in humanity's journey towards civilization. Archaeologists have uncovered large villages across the region, often sprawling along riverbanks or low mounds. Unlike earlier Neolithic settlements, these communities show evidence of planned layouts. Houses were arranged in rows or clusters, with shared spaces that likely facilitated communal labor and social cohesion. Central areas suggest gathering places, possibly for ritual or administrative purposes, though no grand temples or palaces yet existed. The uniformity of domestic architecture hints at emerging social differentiation, even if rulers or elites remain elusive. Irrigation agriculture was central to Ubaid life. Canals, ditches, and embankments directed river water to fields, allowing communities to grow surplus crops reliably. Wheat, barley, and legumes formed the staple diet, supplemented by fishing and pastoralism. This mastery of water management foreshadowed the monumental irrigation systems of later Sumerian cities. The ability to harness and distribute resources implies coordination, specialized knowledge, and leadership structures, precursors to formal governance. Pottery and artifacts from the Ubaid period reveal a sophisticated culture. Fine-painted ceramics, decorative figurines, and stone tools indicate skilled craftsmanship and aesthetic sensibility. These objects were widely distributed, suggesting long-distance exchange networks that connected disparate settlements. Through material culture alone, we see a civilization experimenting with economy, technology, and identity long before kings and writing would record it. Yet much of the Ubaid record has been lost. Alluvial floods repeatedly covered sites in layers of silt and sediment, burying entire villages for millennia. Modern excavations reveal only fragments of this buried world. It is a civilization largely invisible to the untrained eye, overshadowed by the grandeur of the cities it enabled. Social hierarchy appears to have emerged gradually. Certain households contained larger quantities of prestige goods, while others were more modest. This suggests differences in wealth or status, though no palace or administrative building marks a formal elite. The Ubaid people were experimenting with power structures, testing communal versus hierarchical organization in ways that would shape Mesopotamia's future. Perhaps most striking is how the Ubaid civilization demonstrates that urbanization is a process, not a sudden invention. Large villages, irrigation, craft specialization, and social differentiation were all in place hundreds of years before the Sumerians codified city life. The Ubaid people left no written records, no chronicles of kings, no monumental inscriptions. Their legacy survives in the buried foundations of the cities that would eventually dominate the region and in the subtle continuity of ideas about agriculture, settlement, and social organization. The Ubaid civilization is a reminder that before history was recorded, humans were already building complexity into their lives. They were shaping landscapes, communities, and knowledge systems that would outlast them, quietly laying the groundwork for one of the most transformative civilizations in human history. Jomon Culture. Long before rice paddies shaped the islands of Japan, the Jomon people were carving a distinct path in human prehistory. Stretching from roughly 14,000 to 300 BCE, the Jomon culture is one of the longest-lasting prehistoric traditions anywhere in the world, remarkable not only for its longevity, but for its unexpected complexity. While much of global history focuses on the rise of agriculture and cities, the Jomon demonstrate that sophisticated societies could thrive for millennia without writing, monumental architecture, or formal states. The most famous legacy of the Jomon is their pottery. Some of the oldest in the world, these clay vessels date back over 12,000 years. They are elaborately decorated with cord impressions, incised patterns, and sculpted motifs. Far from simple containers, these objects reflect aesthetic sensibilities, ritual purposes, and technological ingenuity. Making pottery at such an early date required knowledge of materials, kilns, and firing techniques, skills passed down through countless generations. Jomon society was primarily based on hunting, gathering, and fishing. Coastal communities exploited marine resources, while inland groups cultivated wild plants and hunted game. Seasonal cycles determined settlement patterns, but unlike many other hunter-gatherers, the Jomon built long-term dwellings. Pit houses and raised structures served as homes for generations, and evidence of repeated reconstruction indicates a commitment to place, community, and continuity. These were not transient camps, they were enduring settlements. The Jomon also engaged in symbolic and ritual activity. Shell middens, figurines known as dogu, and ceremonial pits suggest spiritual beliefs deeply intertwined with daily life. Burials, sometimes accompanied by grave goods, point to complex social practices and reverence for ancestors. There is no evidence of kings, written law, or formal hierarchy, yet social cohesion was maintained through shared customs, cooperation, and cultural continuity. Over thousands of years, the Jomon people refined their technologies. Stone tools, bone implements, and lacquered objects reveal incremental innovation. Communities adapted to environmental changes, from glacial retreat to shifts in sea level, demonstrating resilience without centralized control. Trade networks, while limited, connected distant groups through exchange of obsidian, jade, and other raw materials, hinting at sophisticated interaction across regions. Despite their accomplishments, the Jomon way of life gradually gave way to the Yayoi people, who brought wet rice agriculture, metallurgy, and new settlement patterns around 300 BCE. Yet the Jomon left a lasting imprint. Their pottery, ritual practices, and patterns of habitation influenced subsequent cultures and provide one of the clearest windows into the possibilities of human organization without written records. Jomon culture challenges assumptions about the inevitability of farming and state formation as prerequisites for complexity. It shows that societies could endure for thousands of years, maintain intricate technologies, and develop rich cultural lives without kings, cities, or inscriptions. In doing so, it reminds us that prehistory was not primitive or chaotic. It was experimental, adaptive, and deeply human. The islands of Japan may have been remote, but the Jomon people demonstrate that even in isolation, humans were capable of sustaining vibrant, sophisticated, and enduring civilizations long before history was written down. Kebaran and Natufian cultures. Long before wheat fields and olive groves defined the Levant, human communities were quietly experimenting with ways of living that would eventually make agriculture possible. Stretching from roughly 23,000 to 9,800 BCE, the Kebaran and later Natufian cultures represent some of the earliest examples of sedentary or semi-sedentary hunter-gatherers, yet they are almost entirely absent from mainstream narratives that credit farming with the rise of civilization. The Kebaran period, emerging after the last glacial maximum, was marked by mobile bands of hunter-gatherers who gradually began establishing seasonal base camps. These were not temporary shelters hastily abandoned after a few weeks. Stone tools, microliths, and hearths indicate repeated habitation and careful organization. People were experimenting with storing food, processing wild cereals, and maintaining knowledge across generations. Early steps toward the sedentary life we often associate with farming. By the Natufian period, roughly 13,000 to 9,800 BCE, the pace of change accelerated. Communities began constructing permanent huts, circular or semi-subterranean dwellings that could support longer-term residents. Hearths, storage pits, and communal areas reflect increasing social complexity. Graves and burial practices show reverence for the dead, sometimes accompanied by decorative items or animal remains, suggesting ritualized behavior and symbolic thought embedded in everyday life. These were not casual practices, they were conscious acts of cultural continuity. The Natufians also reveal the precursors to agriculture. Archaeological evidence shows intensive gathering of wild cereals, nuts, and fruits, along with hunting of gazelle and other game. Some scholars argue they were experimenting with proto-cultivation techniques long before full domestication appeared. This is a society bridging the gap between mobility and settlement, showing that human innovation does not wait for writing or kings. Material culture adds another layer of sophistication. Stone and bone tools, personal ornaments, and carved symbolic objects indicate specialized skills and cultural expression. Communities were connected, sharing ideas and techniques over large regions, establishing early networks that would later support village life and farming. Yet despite their importance, these cultures are nearly erased from popular accounts. History textbooks often begin with the Neolithic Revolution, presenting agriculture as a sudden invention. The Kebaran and Natufian peoples, who laid the groundwork for sedentism and social organization, receive only passing mention. Their innovations were subtle but profound. They taught humanity how to live together, plan, and manipulate resources long before domesticated plants and animals existed. These cultures also challenge assumptions about linear progress. Civilization did not emerge fully formed. It was built upon centuries, even millennia, of experimentation in settlement, ritual, and resource management. The Kebaran and Natufian peoples remind us that complex human behavior existed long before cities or writing, that human creativity and adaptation were already at work shaping the world. In the Levant, under the shadow of the Fertile Crescent, these prehistoric communities quietly orchestrated the first steps towards social complexity. Their legacy survives in the patterns of habitation, symbolic objects, and early technologies that would eventually make villages and farming possible, but only to those willing to look beyond the conventional story. Clovis Culture. For decades, the Clovis culture was taught as the cornerstone of early American prehistory. Its distinctive fluted stone points were once considered proof that Clovis people were the first humans to inhabit North America. Archaeologists celebrated these spearheads, found across much of the continent, as evidence of a uniform, pioneering culture spanning thousands of miles. Yet as research has progressed, Clovis has proven both pivotal and puzzling. A civilization whose sudden appearance and disappearance challenge our understanding of early human settlement. Clovis sites, dating from roughly 13,200 to 12,900 BCE, are characterized primarily by their remarkable stone tools. The fluted points, expertly chipped to create thin, aerodynamic spearheads, were mounted on wooden shafts for hunting megafauna such as mammoths, mastodons, and giant bison. These tools reflect not only technical skill, but also shared knowledge and cultural continuity. They appear across distant regions, from New Mexico to the eastern United States, indicating migration patterns, trade, or communication among groups separated by hundreds of kilometers. Beyond the tools, Clovis people maintained semi-nomadic lifestyles, following game and seasonal resources. Sites reveal hearths, kill zones, and temporary shelters, indicating complex coordination and social organization. Yet they left no written records, no monumental architecture, and no permanent settlements. Their sophistication exists entirely in the material traces of their daily lives and their extraordinary craftsmanship. What makes Clovis even more extraordinary is how abruptly it disappears. Around 12,900 BCE, the culture vanishes from the archaeological record, coinciding with the onset of the Younger Dryas, a sudden global cooling event. Many of the large animals they hunted also faced extinction. Whether climate change, overhunting, disease, or some combination caused their decline remains debated, but the disappearance was swift enough to suggest dramatic societal disruption. Despite its brevity, Clovis culture laid important groundwork for subsequent populations. Later groups in North America adopted and adapted aspects of Clovis technology, illustrating continuity amid change. Yet mainstream narratives have often reduced Clovis to a simple first American story, ignoring the abrupt disappearance, environmental pressures, and cultural sophistication embedded in their legacy. Clovis also challenges linear assumptions about civilization. Advanced toolmaking, coordinated hunting, and continent-wide dispersal occurred without cities, writing, or formal hierarchy. It reminds us that human ingenuity and societal complexity existed long before permanent settlements became the dominant paradigm. Archaeology continues to refine our understanding of Clovis. New discoveries push the timeline of human presence in the Americas further back, integrating Clovis into a more nuanced and complicated story. Still, its fluted points remain iconic, silent witnesses to a culture that thrived briefly, adapted brilliantly, and then vanished, leaving only stone as testimony to its ingenuity. In this way, Clovis is both a beginning and an enigma, a prehistoric civilization that compels us to reconsider what it truly means to build a society before recorded history. Pre-Pottery Neolithic B peoples, before cities, kingdoms, and written law shaped the Near East. A remarkable society was quietly experimenting with the foundations of agriculture and settled life. The Pre-Pottery Neolithic B, or PPNB, people thrived roughly between 8800 and 6500 BCE across regions of modern Jordan, Syria, and Israel. They represent a transitional phase in human history, a civilization caught between nomadic foraging and the full emergence of urbanized societies. Their achievements, largely unrecorded in texts, reveal sophisticated strategies for survival, community, and ritual that would influence generations to come. Pre-Pottery Neolithic B peoples' communities built early agricultural villages, often constructed from mud brick with well-defined layouts. Houses were rectangular, spacious, and sometimes arranged in rows or clusters, suggesting coordinated planning. These were not temporary shelters. They were durable, long-term structures that could support multi-generational families and complex social interaction. Villages were often situated near reliable water sources and fertile land, reflecting careful environmental knowledge and planning. Agriculture at PPNB sites shows remarkable sophistication. Residents cultivated domesticated wheat, barley, legumes, and other plants, while simultaneously managing livestock such as goats, sheep, and cattle. The integration of farming and herding indicates advanced understanding of seasonal cycles, resource management, and sustainability. These communities did not rely solely on hunting and gathering. They were actively shaping their environment to meet long-term needs. Ritual life was equally advanced. Archaeologists have uncovered plastered human skulls, sometimes modeled with facial features, placed within homes or communal areas. These artifacts suggest ancestor veneration, spiritual practices, and complex symbolic thought, all without temples or written codification. Rituals were embedded into daily life, bridging domesticity and the sacred in ways that hint at early forms of societal cohesion and collective memory. PPNB people also experimented with technologies that would support later urbanization. Tools for grinding, cutting, and woodworking, as well as early forms of pottery experimentation, demonstrate technical innovation. Shared architectural techniques, decorative elements, and burial customs indicate knowledge transfer between communities, an early form of cultural continuity. Despite their achievements, the PPNB people gradually disappeared from the archaeological record as later cultures, such as the fully urbanized Ubaid and other Neolithic societies, rose to dominance. Their villages were often abandoned or integrated into succeeding settlements, and much of their cultural identity was absorbed into larger social networks. Yet the traces they left, domesticated plants, architectural practices, and symbolic artifacts, persist as evidence of their enduring influence. What makes PPNB remarkable is its bridging role. These communities demonstrate that civilization did not emerge instantaneously. Complex social behavior, agriculture, permanent dwellings, and symbolic practices existed before writing, before kings, before cities. They were crafting the building blocks of history long before history could be recorded. The pre-pottery Neolithic B peoples remind us that the story of civilization is layered. Beneath the monuments, inscriptions, and chronicles of later societies lie invisible pioneers, people who experimented, adapted, and organized life in ways that made the rise of urban culture possible. Their legacy survives not in words, but in the very foundations of settled human life.